If you're hearing this, it already went too far. The first thing Emily Carter noticed wasn't the sterile white ceiling above her hospital bed in Chicago or the soft beeping of the monitors beside her, but the fact that someone was already there before she fully understood how she got there. Her throat felt dry, her body heavy like she had slept for too long and too little at the same time, and when her eyes finally adjusted, she saw him. Jason Miller was standing near the end of her bed, completely still, his arms crossed, his face unreadable in a way that made the room feel colder than it should have been. There was no warm greeting, no relief, no sign of concern that would normally come from someone who shared a household history, even if only through marriage. Instead, there was distance, like he was observing something instead of someone. Emily blinked slowly, trying to piece together the last thing she remembered: fragments of dizziness, a rushed ride, voices overlapping, but nothing clear enough to form a complete memory. Jason didn't move closer, didn't speak right away, and that silence itself felt like pressure filling every corner of the room. A nurse had come in earlier. She could tell from the faint smell of antiseptic and the neatly adjusted foreline in her arm, but now it was just the two of them, suspended in a moment that didn't feel accidental. Emily tried to sit up a little, but her strength didn't fully cooperate, and that small struggle made Jason finally shift his weight. Not toward her, but slightly away, as if even the smallest change in her condition carried meaning he was already interpreting. "You're awake," he said at last, his voice controlled, almost rehearsed, like he had been waiting to say those exact words but wasn't sure how they would land. Emily nodded faintly, her mind still foggy, and she tried to find something safe to say, something normal, but nothing about this felt normal. There was something unspoken sitting between them, something heavy enough that it made even eye contact feel like a decision. She noticed his eyes flick briefly toward the monitors, then back to her face, like he was tracking more than just her condition. Outside the glass window of the room, the hospital corridor moved on as usual, doctors walking past, carts rolling, distant conversations blending into the background. But inside this room, time felt paused. Emily finally managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper, "What happened?" Jason didn't answer immediately, and when he did, it wasn't really an answer. It was more like a reminder of something she didn't fully understand yet. "You don't remember anything, do you?" he said, not accusing, but not comforting either. That question changed the air in the room. Emily felt a tightening in her chest, not from pain, but from uncertainty, from the realization that whatever brought her here was not going to be simple to explain. Jason stepped a fraction closer now, just enough to make his presence harder to ignore, and lowered his voice. "They said you needed time before making any decisions," he added, as if that explained everything and nothing at the same time. Emily looked at him, searching his expression for something familiar, something that matched the version of Jason she thought she knew from family dinners and brief conversations at home. But this version felt different, sharpened by something she couldn't name yet. And in that silence, with hospital lights humming overhead and every second stretching longer than it should, Emily realized that whatever happened before she woke up was still unfolding, just out of reach of her memory. Emily Carter stayed still in the hospital bed, trying to steady her breathing as the silence between her and Jason Miller continued to stretch in a way that felt heavier with every passing second. The monitors beside her kept a steady rhythm, a reminder that her body was still functioning normally, even though her thoughts felt scattered and incomplete. Jason remained near the end of the bed, not sitting, not relaxing, just standing in a way that suggested he was waiting for something rather than simply visiting. Emily searched his face again, hoping for some familiar expression, but what she found instead was restraint, like he was carefully holding back emotions he did not want to reveal too quickly. She shifted, slightly, her hands gripping the edge of the blanket, and asked again in a softer tone what exactly had happened before she woke up. Jason exhaled slowly, his gaze moving briefly toward the hallway outside the room where distant footsteps echoed, then back to her. He spoke carefully, choosing each word as if it carried more weight than it should. He said there had been an emergency situation earlier in the day, something involving her health that required immediate attention, but he did not give full details, and the lack of clarity made Emily feel even more uncertain. She tried to process his words, but her memory still offered nothing solid, only fragments that refused to connect into a complete picture. A nurse passed by the door, briefly glancing in before continuing down the corridor, leaving the room feeling even more isolated. Jason finally moved closer, but only by a small step, positioning himself beside the chair instead of directly at her bedside, as if maintaining distance was intentional. Emily noticed the way his hands flexed slightly, a subtle sign of tension he was trying to control. She asked him if something was wrong, not just with her condition, but with everything surrounding it, and for the first time his expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough for her to notice a change in his composure. He said there were decisions that still had to be made, decisions that could not wait much longer, and that phrase made Emily feel an immediate pressure she could not fully explain. She asked what kind of decisions, her voice weaker now, and Jason hesitated before answering. He mentioned that the medical staff had outlined procedures that required approval from a family member, and that time was becoming a critical factor in how quickly things needed to move forward. Emily felt her stomach tighten at the vague explanation, not from fear of the medical environment itself, but from the sense that she was not being told everything she needed to know. She looked away for a moment toward the window, where daylight filtered through partially closed blinds, casting soft lines across the floor, and tried to gather her thoughts. When she looked back at Jason, she noticed something different in his posture, a subtle shift that made him seem more alert, more tense, as if he was anticipating a moment that had not yet arrived. He repeated that it was important she understand the urgency, and this time his tone carried a sharper edge, though still controlled. Emily asked him directly why he was the one speaking for her decisions, and that question seemed to land heavily between them. Jason paused, then responded that he was the only one available who could, and that answer only deepened the uncertainty in the room. Emily felt a growing disconnect between what she was being told and what she instinctively felt was missing from the explanation. The monitors continued their steady rhythm, unchanged, indifferent to the tension building quietly in the space. Jason's eyes shifted again toward the hallway, and for a brief moment, he looked like he was expecting someone else to enter the room at any second. Emily noticed that anticipation and realized that whatever was happening was not limited to just the two of them in that moment, but was part of something larger that had already been set in motion before she woke up. Emily Carter remained in the hospital bed, trying to make sense of the fragments she had been given, but the more she listened to Jason Miller, the more she felt that something important was still missing. The room felt unchanged on the surface, with the same steady monitor sounds and the same sterile lighting, but the atmosphere between them had shifted into something more uncertain and difficult to define. Jason stood near the chair now, not sitting, his attention divided between Emily and the hallway outside, as if he was waiting for something to interrupt their conversation at any moment. Emily noticed this distraction and followed his gaze briefly, but the corridor outside remained calm, with only occasional movement of staff passing by. She turned her attention back to Jason and asked him again, more directly, what exactly had happened before she woke up and why she could not remember any of it. Jason hesitated longer this time, and when he spoke, his explanation remained incomplete, focusing more on urgency and medical decisions than on clear events. He mentioned that the situation earlier had required immediate intervention and that her arrival at the hospital had not been routine, but he still avoided providing specific details that would help her piece everything together. Emily felt frustration building quietly beneath her confusion, not anger, but a deep need for clarity that was not being satisfied. She asked him why he seemed so certain about making decisions on her behalf, and Jason responded that it was not about certainty but necessity, because time-sensitive choices had already been placed in motion by medical staff. That answer did not comfort her. Instead, it made her feel even more removed from her own situation, as if she were observing her life from a distance rather than participating in it. Jason finally pulled the chair slightly closer but still did not sit, and when he spoke again, his tone lowered as if he was carefully choosing not to be overheard, even though the room was empty. He said there were documents involved, permissions that needed approval from family, and that he had already been asked to step into that role because no one else had arrived or responded in time. Emily processed his words slowly, trying to understand the structure of what he was describing, but something about it still felt incomplete, like a version of the truth that had been edited down to only what was necessary. She asked him if anyone else from her family had been contacted, and Jason paused before answering that attempts had been made, but responses were still pending. That answer created another layer of unease in Emily's mind, because it suggested a gap in communication that did not feel accidental. Outside the room, a set of footsteps stopped briefly near the door, then continued on, leaving the two of them alone again in the same quiet tension. Jason glanced toward that moment of interruption, then back at Emily, and for the first time, she noticed a hint of impatience in his expression, not directed at her specifically, but at the situation itself. She asked him what he was not telling her, and that question seemed to change the air immediately. Jason exhaled slowly, then said that there were aspects of the situation she did not yet need to focus on until the medical team confirmed more information. Emily felt a stronger sense of disconnect at that response, because it suggested that information about her own condition was being filtered before it reached her. She looked down at her hands for a moment, trying to steady herself, and when she looked back up, Jason was no longer just watching her, but also listening for something beyond the room. That subtle shift made Emily realize that whatever was happening was not fully contained within their conversation, and that there were decisions, actions, and consequences already moving forward outside of her awareness, shaping the next moments before she was even fully informed of the present one. The hospital room felt quieter now, but the silence was no longer comforting for Emily Carter as she lay in bed trying to process everything Jason Miller had told her. The steady sound of the monitor beside her continued at the same rhythm, yet it only made the situation feel more real and more constrained, as if every second was being measured and accounted for without her full understanding. Jason remained close, but his attention was no longer fully on her, because his eyes kept shifting toward the hallway outside the room, where occasional movement from hospital staff continued to pass by. Emily noticed this pattern and followed his gaze again. But nothing unusual was visible, only the same controlled pace of a medical environment that never fully stopped. She turned back to him and asked if there was something happening that she was not being told, and Jason immediately responded that everything was under control, although his tone carried a level of tension that did not fully match his words. Emily pressed further, asking why it felt like she was being kept out of her own situation, and Jason paused for a moment before replying that medical protocols required time and confirmation before full information could be shared with patients in her condition. That explanation did not satisfy her, because it felt like a barrier rather than clarity, and she could sense that more was being held back than what was being said. She asked him again about the decisions he mentioned earlier, specifically what kind of decisions were being made and why they required immediate attention. Jason finally moved the chair fully into position beside the bed, sitting down for the first time since she had woken up, but even in that movement there was hesitation, as if he was carefully choosing how to present what came next. He explained that the medical team had outlined procedures that required consent from a designated family representative, and that due to timing constraints, he had been placed in that role temporarily. Emily listened carefully, trying to understand the structure of what he was saying, but the language remained distant and procedural, offering no emotional grounding or personal context that would help her feel connected to her own situation. She asked him if he had signed anything already, and Jason hesitated before answering that some preliminary authorizations had been reviewed, but nothing final had been completed without further confirmation. That answer created another layer of uncertainty, because it implied that her situation was already moving forward in administrative ways without her full awareness or participation. Emily looked toward the 4-line in her arm, then back at Jason, and asked why she could not remember anything that led up to this moment. Jason's expression softened slightly, but only for a brief moment before returning to a controlled seriousness. He said that memory gaps could happen after medical incidents that required urgent intervention, and that it was not uncommon for patients to feel disoriented when they first regained awareness. Emily absorbed his explanation, but it did not fully resolve the feeling that there was a gap larger than what he was describing. Outside the room, footsteps paused again near the doorway, and this time Jason visibly reacted, turning his head with more alertness than before. The interruption lasted only a few seconds, but it changed his posture, and Emily noticed the immediate shift in his attention. When the footsteps continued past the room, Jason exhaled slowly and turned back to her, but now there was a noticeable increase in urgency in the way he spoke. He repeated that there was limited time to finalize certain decisions, and that delays could affect how quickly her care plan could proceed. Emily felt a tightening in her chest again, not from physical discomfort, but from the growing sense that she was being moved through a process she could not fully see. She asked him directly if there was something she should be worried about, and Jason paused longer than before, his eyes no longer fixed on her, but briefly lowered toward the floor. When he finally responded, he said that worry was not the focus, but understanding the situation clearly was what mattered most right now. That answer, instead of calming her, made the room feel even more uncertain, because it suggested that there were details still waiting just beyond what she was being allowed to know, and that those details were already influencing everything happening around her. Emily Carter felt the weight of the situation growing heavier the longer she stayed in the hospital bed, as Jason Miller continued to sit beside her with an expression that remained carefully controlled but increasingly tense. The steady beeping of the monitor beside her no longer felt like background noise, but instead like a constant reminder that time was moving forward regardless of how incomplete her understanding of the situation remained. Jason's attention kept shifting between her and the hallway outside the room, and this repeated pattern made Emily more aware that his focus was divided between what was happening inside the room and something he expected outside of it. She asked him directly why he kept looking toward the door, and Jason responded that hospital staff often moved quickly when updates were required, but his answer lacked the calm assurance that would normally accompany such a statement. Emily noticed that his hands were now resting together in a tighter position than before, suggesting that he was holding back more than he was expressing verbally. She asked him again to clarify what decisions were still pending, and Jason leaned slightly forward, lowering his voice as if the conversation itself required additional privacy despite the empty room. He explained that there were administrative steps tied to her medical file that required immediate attention from a family representative, and that those steps would determine how quickly certain procedures could move forward. Emily listened carefully, trying to separate medical necessity from procedural urgency, but everything still felt blurred together without clear distinction. She asked him if she had ever agreed to any of this before she lost her memory of the events leading up to her hospitalization, and Jason paused for a noticeable moment before responding that consent forms were typically handled under urgent conditions when patients were not fully conscious or able to respond. That answer created a new layer of discomfort for Emily, because it suggested that decisions had already been made in a state she could not recall or verify. She looked down at her arm where the 4-line was connected, then slowly back at Jason, asking why she still could not remember anything at all from the beginning of the day. Jason repeated that memory loss after medical distress was not unusual, but his tone now carried a subtle insistence that the explanation should be accepted without further challenge. Emily did not respond immediately, because something about the way he avoided specific details made her feel like there was more beneath the surface that was not being shared. The hallway outside remained active, with faint movement and distant voices occasionally passing the room, but none of it entered their space directly, leaving the conversation between them isolated and intense. Jason finally stood up from the chair, pacing one step toward the window before stopping, as if trying to organize his thoughts before speaking again. He said that the priority now was stabilizing her condition and completing the necessary approvals so there would be no delays in treatment moving forward. Emily asked him why it felt like everything was already decided before she even regained awareness, and Jason turned back toward her with a more serious expression than before. He responded that hospital systems often operated under strict timelines, especially when multiple evaluations were involved, and that sometimes decisions had to be prepared in advance to avoid complications later. Emily remained silent for a moment, absorbing the explanation, but still feeling disconnected from it emotionally and logically. She asked if anyone from her life outside the hospital had confirmed any of this situation, and Jason said that contact attempts were still ongoing, but responses had not yet been received. That statement increased Emily's sense of isolation, because it suggested that the only consistent presence she had right now was Jason himself, despite the lack of clarity surrounding everything he was explaining. Jason returned to the chair, but did not sit immediately, instead placing his hands on the back of it while looking briefly toward the door once again. Emily noticed this repetition and asked him what he was expecting to happen, and Jason replied that he was not expecting anything, but simply ensuring that everything remained on schedule. His words were calm, but his posture suggested a level of alertness that did not fully align with his explanation. Emily leaned back slightly into the pillow, feeling both physically and mentally drained by the ongoing uncertainty, while the steady rhythm of the monitor continued unchanged. In that moment, she realized that every answer she had received so far had created not clarity, but additional questions that were still waiting to be resolved. Emily Carter lay in the hospital bed feeling as if the room had slowly become smaller, not physically, but in the way every conversation with Jason Miller seemed to narrow her understanding instead of expanding it. The steady sound of the monitor beside her continued to mark time, but she no longer felt like time was something she was fully part of, only something happening around her. Jason had returned to sitting beside the chair, but his posture remained tense, and his attention still drifted toward the hallway at irregular intervals, as though he was expecting an interruption that had not yet arrived. Emily watched him carefully and asked why he kept reacting to every sound outside the room, and Jason responded that hospitals were constantly active environments where updates and staff movement were normal, but his explanation did not fully align with the level of alertness in his expression. Emily shifted slightly in bed, trying to find a more stable position, and asked him again what exactly was still unresolved in her case. Jason took a slow breath before answering, and for a moment he looked like he was deciding how much information he could safely share. He said that certain administrative confirmations were still pending, and that those confirmations were necessary before her care plan could fully proceed without interruption. Emily listened closely, but the phrasing still felt distant and structured in a way that kept her emotionally disconnected from her own situation. She asked him if she was at any point involved in these decisions before she lost her memory of the earlier events, and Jason replied that in urgent medical situations, decisions were often prepared in advance to prevent delays, especially when a patient was not fully responsive. That explanation again left Emily with the same feeling she had experienced earlier, a sense that things were already moving forward without her clear participation or awareness. She looked toward the window for a moment, where soft daylight filtered through the blinds, and then back at Jason, asking if there had been any clear explanation from the medical team about why she could not recall anything prior to waking up in the hospital. Jason repeated that temporary memory disruption could occur after physical stress or medical intervention, but his tone now carried a subtle firmness that suggested he did not want the conversation to move further in that direction. Emily noticed this shift and felt an increasing need to understand what was being avoided rather than what was being said. The hallway outside the room became slightly more active, with footsteps pausing briefly near the door before continuing on, and Jason immediately reacted by turning his head toward the sound. That reaction was quick and instinctive, and Emily observed it closely, realizing that his attention was constantly divided between her and something external that she could not yet identify. When the hallway grew quiet again, Jason exhaled and returned his focus to her, but his posture remained rigid. Emily asked him directly what he was waiting for, and Jason responded that he was not waiting for anything specific, only ensuring that everything remained aligned with the expected timeline of her care. That answer did not provide reassurance, because it implied that there was a structure already in motion that she had not been fully informed about. Emily felt a growing pressure in her chest, not from physical pain, but from the sense that her situation was being managed through steps she could not see. She asked him if anyone from her personal life had been able to confirm what was happening to her, and Jason said that attempts had been made but responses were still incomplete. That statement deepened the feeling of isolation in the room, because it reinforced the idea that Jason remained the only consistent point of communication she had access to at that moment. Jason stood again, walking a short distance toward the window before stopping, as if thinking through something carefully before speaking. He said that once the pending confirmations were complete, the medical team would be able to move forward without further uncertainty. Emily looked at him and asked why everything felt like it was already decided before she even regained full awareness of her situation. Jason turned back toward her and said that medical systems often required preparatory steps to ensure continuity of care, and that sometimes patients only became fully aware of those steps after stabilization. Emily fell silent for a moment, absorbing his words but still feeling a disconnect between explanation and understanding. The monitor beside her continued its steady rhythm, unchanged, marking a contrast between the controlled environment around her and the unresolved uncertainty in her mind. Jason returned to the chair but remained standing beside it rather than sitting, and Emily noticed that even in stillness, he seemed prepared for something to change at any moment. That realization left her with a lingering sense that whatever was happening was not contained within the conversation they were having, but extended beyond it into decisions and actions already unfolding outside her immediate awareness. Emily Carter felt the atmosphere in the hospital room shift in a subtle but noticeable way as the conversation with Jason Miller continued to unfold without clear resolution. The steady monitor beside her maintained its consistent rhythm, but her attention was no longer anchored to it, because her focus kept returning to Jason's behavior and the way he continuously monitored the hallway outside the room. He was now standing again rather than sitting, positioned slightly closer to the door than before, and Emily observed that his body language suggested anticipation rather than calm presence. She asked him why he kept positioning himself that way, and Jason replied that it was simply habit from being in hospitals for an extended period, where staff movement and updates often required immediate attention. His answer was smooth, but Emily noticed that it did not fully align with the tension she continued to see in his posture. She shifted slightly in the bed, feeling a growing need to understand the structure of everything she was being told, and asked him again what exactly was still preventing her situation from being fully explained. Jason paused longer this time, and when he spoke, his tone carried a more deliberate seriousness. He said that there were still formal confirmations required from medical personnel before any complete explanation could be provided, and that until those confirmations were finalized, the situation would remain in a limited communication state. Emily listened carefully, but the explanation still felt incomplete, as if it was designed to describe process rather than truth. She asked him why she felt like every answer was carefully controlled, and Jason responded that medical environments often required careful communication to avoid confusion or unnecessary stress for patients. Emily did not respond immediately, because that explanation, while logical on the surface, did not resolve the deeper uncertainty she felt building. Inside her, outside the room, the sound of footsteps approached and then slowed near the door, causing Jason to immediately turn his head in that direction with increased alertness. The pause lasted only a few seconds before the footsteps continued onward, but the reaction it triggered in Jason was immediate and unmistakable. Emily watched this closely and realized that his awareness of the hallway was constant, almost as if he expected a specific moment or person to appear at any time. When the corridor became quiet again, Jason returned his attention to her, but his expression remained tense. Emily asked him directly if he was waiting for someone, and Jason responded that he was not waiting for anyone in particular, only monitoring the flow of hospital activity related to her care. That answer did not fully align with what Emily had observed, and she felt a stronger sense of disconnect between his words and his behavior. She asked him if there was something about her situation that she still did not understand, and Jason hesitated before answering that her medical file contained ongoing evaluations that required coordination between multiple departments before final conclusions could be shared. Emily absorbed this information, but still felt that something important was being withheld or delayed in a way that was not fully transparent. She looked toward the 4 line in her arm again, then back at Jason, and asked if anyone from her personal life had confirmed her condition or visited the hospital. Jason replied that contact attempts were still ongoing, but responses had not yet been received, and that hospitals often experienced delays in communication when multiple parties were involved. That response intensified Emily's sense of isolation, because it confirmed that the only consistent presence in her situation remained Jason, despite the lack of clarity surrounding his role and the information he was providing. Jason moved a step closer to the window again, briefly looking outside before turning back toward her, and said that once all confirmations were completed, the medical team would be able to proceed without further delay or uncertainty. Emily asked him why everything felt like it was already in motion before she regained full awareness of it, and Jason replied that medical systems often prepared necessary steps in advance to ensure continuity of care. His tone remained calm, but there was an underlying firmness that suggested he was not expecting further challenge to that explanation. Emily fell silent for a moment, trying to reconcile what she was being told with the growing feeling that important parts of the situation were still outside her understanding. The monitor continued its steady rhythm beside her, unchanged, while Jason stood near the chair without fully sitting, maintaining a posture that suggested readiness rather than rest. In that moment, Emily realized that the answers she had received were forming a pattern that pointed not toward clarity, but toward a larger structure of decisions and actions already underway beyond her immediate awareness. Emily Carter remained in the hospital bed with a growing sense that the conversation with Jason Miller had reached a point where clarity was still being withheld behind carefully structured explanations. The steady rhythm of the monitor beside her continued without change, but her awareness of it had faded into the background as her attention focused more intensely on Jason and his increasingly alert behavior. He was now positioned closer to the doorway than before, no longer simply standing beside the chair, but subtly orienting himself toward the hallway, as if anticipating an interruption. Emily observed this shift and asked him again why he kept reacting to every small sound outside the room, and Jason responded that hospital environments were unpredictable and required constant awareness of staff movement related to patient care. His answer remained consistent, but Emily could sense that it did not fully account for the level of vigilance she was witnessing. She adjusted herself slightly in bed, her voice quieter now, and asked him if there was something specific he was expecting to happen. Jason paused before answering, then said that there were ongoing processes tied to her medical file that required coordination and that any interruption in timing could delay important steps in her care. Emily listened carefully, but the explanation again felt incomplete, as though it described procedure without addressing the underlying reason for the tension in the room. She asked him if those processes had already been started without her full awareness, and Jason replied that in situations involving urgent medical evaluation, certain preliminary steps are often initiated before full patient communication can take place. That response deepened Emily's uncertainty, because it confirmed that parts of her situation were already in motion outside of her direct understanding. For a moment, the room fell into a quieter state, with only the steady sound of the monitor marking time, but that quiet did not feel calm. Instead, it felt suspended, as if something was building just beyond the visible space. Suddenly, footsteps became audible in the hallway outside the room, slower at first, then pausing briefly near the doorway. Jason immediately reacted, turning his head sharply toward the sound, and his posture became more rigid as he focused on the direction of the corridor. Emily noticed this reaction clearly, because it was faster and more pronounced than anything she had seen before. The footsteps lingered for a moment, then continued past the room, fading gradually down the hall. Jason remained still for a few seconds after they passed, then exhaled slowly and returned his attention to Emily, but his expression now carried a higher level of urgency. Emily asked him directly what he was waiting for, and Jason responded that he was not waiting for anything specific, only ensuring that all required updates were properly communicated as they became available. That explanation did not align with the intensity of his reaction, and Emily felt a stronger sense that there was something beyond what he was saying. She asked him again if anyone else had confirmed her condition or spoken with the hospital staff, and Jason replied that contact attempts were still ongoing, but responses had not yet been finalized. That answer reinforced her feeling of isolation, because it suggested that no external confirmation had yet been received from her personal life, leaving Jason as the primary source of information. Jason moved closer to the window again, briefly looking outside before turning back toward her, and said that once all pending confirmations were completed, the medical team would be able to proceed without further delays or uncertainties. Emily asked him why it felt like everything was already decided before she had regained full awareness of her situation, and Jason replied that medical systems often operate on structured timelines designed to ensure continuity of care. His tone remained controlled, but there was a firmness in his delivery that discouraged further questioning. Emily fell silent for a moment, absorbing the explanation but still feeling a disconnect between what she was being told and what she instinctively felt was missing. The monitor beside her continued its steady rhythm, unchanged, while Jason stood near the chair without fully sitting, maintaining a posture that suggested readiness rather than rest. In that moment, Emily realized that the situation surrounding her was not contained within the room itself, but extended beyond it through decisions, confirmations, and actions already in progress that she had not yet been fully informed of, leaving her with the persistent sense that the full truth remained just outside her reach. Emily Carter lay in the hospital bed feeling as though the entire structure of her situation had finally reached a breaking point, even though nothing in the room had physically changed. The monitor beside her continued its steady rhythm, but it no longer provided reassurance, only a reminder that time was moving forward regardless of her lack of clarity. Jason Miller stood near the chair again, his attention divided between her and the hallway outside, and this time his posture carried a level of alertness that was no longer subtle. Emily watched him carefully and asked him why he seemed more tense than before, and Jason replied that he was simply ensuring all updates related to her case were being properly managed as they arrived. His explanation was consistent with what he had said before, but the intensity in his focus suggested something beyond routine monitoring. Emily shifted slightly in the bed and asked him again if there was something specific he was waiting for, and Jason paused for a moment before responding that hospital staff often moved between cases quickly and that timing could affect how information was delivered. Emily did not respond immediately because she could feel that his answer was not addressing the deeper concern she had been sensing since the beginning of their conversation. A few seconds later, footsteps became audible outside the room, slower than before, and this time they stopped directly near the doorway. Jason immediately turned toward the sound with increased attention, his body becoming still in a way that suggested full focus on the corridor beyond the room. Emily noticed this reaction more clearly than before because it was no longer subtle or occasional, but immediate and precise. The footsteps remained outside for a brief moment, then moved on, continuing down the hallway until they faded. Jason remained in the same position for a few seconds after they disappeared, then slowly returned his attention to Emily, but his expression had changed slightly, carrying a sense of urgency that had not been present earlier. Emily asked him directly what was happening that required so much attention to every sound outside the room, and Jason responded that hospital environments were constantly active and that he was simply staying aware of any updates that could affect her care. His tone remained controlled, but Emily could feel that the explanation did not fully match the level of alertness she was observing. She asked him again if anyone from her personal life had responded to the hospital or confirmed anything about her situation, and Jason replied that contact attempts were still ongoing, but had not yet resulted in any confirmed communication. That answer deepened Emily's sense of separation from everything outside the room, because it reinforced that she had no external point of reference other than Jason at that moment. Jason moved slightly closer to the window again, briefly looking outside before turning back toward her, and said that once all pending confirmations were completed, the medical team would be able to proceed without further delay or uncertainty. Emily asked him why everything felt like it had already been arranged before she regained awareness, and Jason responded that medical systems often required preparation in advance to ensure continuity of care and reduce risk during urgent situations. His voice remained steady, but there was a finality in his tone that suggested he was not expecting further challenge to that explanation. Emily fell silent, looking down at her hands for a moment before turning her gaze back toward him, and she realized that the pattern of information she had been given was always structured in the same way, providing process but never full clarity. The monitor beside her continued its steady rhythm, unchanged, while Jason remained standing near the chair without sitting, maintaining a posture that suggested constant readiness. In that moment, Emily understood that the situation she was in was not defined by a single conversation or a single room, but by a series of decisions and actions already in motion outside her awareness, and that whatever truth was still missing from her understanding had not yet been revealed within the boundaries of what she was being told.